Snow blanketed the quiet streets, muffling the distant sound of church bells ringing across town. Margaret sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter, cradling a warm mug of chamomile tea in her hands. The soft glow of Christmas lights flickered through the window, casting a gentle red and green reflection on the frost-covered glass. Everything was peaceful, exactly as Christmas Eve should be. But something felt off. It was the whispering. She first noticed it when she walked past the living room. At first, it was nothing, just the hushed voices of her two children, Theo and Lillian, giggling over something, likely a last-minute Christmas scheme. But then she caught the words. "We have to go at midnight. It's the only time no one will notice." Margaret's breath caught. Midnight? She stood still, gripping her mug, straining to hear more. "If Mom finds out, she'll never let us go," Theo whispered, his voice tense. Lillian's response was muffled, but Margaret caught enough. "We promised. He's counting on us." Margaret's pulse quickened. Who was counting on them? What could be so important that her children, her responsible, well-behaved children, were sneaking out of the house in the dead of night? She forced herself to move, stepping back toward the hallway before they could catch her eavesdropping. Her mind raced. Could they be talking about a friend? No, that didn't make sense. There was a gravity in Theo's voice, a tension in Lillian's. This wasn't about sneaking out to exchange presents or play in the snow. Margaret had always trusted them, but something about the secrecy unsettled her. And what if they were in danger? She made her decision. She wouldn't confront them, not yet. She would follow them instead. The next few hours passed excruciatingly slow. Margaret tried to act normal, finishing last-minute holiday preparations, laughing at their inside jokes, setting out cookies for Santa as she always did. But her mind never drifted far from what she had overheard. As the clock neared midnight, Margaret's heart pounded. The house was silent. Her children were in their rooms. Or at least, they were supposed to be. Carefully, she slid out of bed, wrapping a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders. She tiptoed to Theo's room first. The door was slightly ajar, and when she peeked in, her stomach dropped. The bed was empty. A soft creak sounded from downstairs. Margaret pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her shawl. She hurried toward the staircase, keeping to the edges of each step to avoid making a sound. When she reached the bottom, she spotted them, Theo and Lillian, bundled up in winter coats, scarves wrapped tightly around their faces, slipping quietly out the front door. Margaret's heart raced. Where were they going? And why did it feel so urgent? She grabbed her own coat, slipped on her boots, and stepped outside into the bitter cold, careful to remain unseen. The snow crunched underfoot as she followed them down the quiet street, her breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. Theo and Lillian moved quickly, walking with purpose. Not a single other soul was out, not at this hour. The streets were lined with twinkling Christmas lights, their soft glow illuminating the fresh snowfall. They passed the church, the town square, the bakery with its festive wreath on the door. Margaret kept her distance, following their every move. Then they turned left, toward the woods. Margaret stopped for a moment, her stomach twisting. The woods? On Christmas Eve? She wanted to call out, to stop them, to demand answers. But something held her back. If they were going into the woods, there had to be a reason. She continued following them, careful to stay hidden behind the trees. Her boots sank into the fresh snow, her breath quickening as they ventured deeper. The further they walked, the darker it became. Only the moonlight and their faint flashlight guided the way. Then they reached it, the old, abandoned cabin at the edge of the forest. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She hadn't thought about this place in years. It had once belonged to the Harper family, but after Daniel Harper's sudden disappearance 6 months ago, it had been left to rot, its windows boarded up, its roof caving in from years of neglect. Margaret watched as Theo knocked softly on the door. A few seconds passed. Then it creaked open. A figure emerged from the darkness inside. Margaret's breath hitched. It was a man, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. He wore tattered clothes, his beard unkempt, his hands trembling slightly as he ushered them inside. Who was he? Margaret felt her fingers go numb, not from the cold, but from the sheer realization of what she was witnessing. She had seen that face before. Daniel Harper. But that was impossible. Daniel Harper was missing. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth, suppressing a gasp. For months, the town had whispered about his disappearance. Some said he had left his family behind in disgrace. Others claimed he had stolen money and fled. But no one had seen him since. And now, here he was, hiding in an abandoned cabin in the woods. Why? And how were her children involved? Margaret crept closer, inching toward the window. Inside, she could see them huddled together, whispering. Lillian handed Daniel a small bag, food, no doubt. Theo offered him a bottle of water. Margaret's heart ached. They've been helping him. How long had this been going on? And why hadn't they told her? Her fingers dug into the bark of the nearest tree as she struggled to make sense of it all. Daniel Harper wasn't just missing, he was hiding. But from what? Or, from whom? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't hear the sound. Footsteps. Behind her. Margaret stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Someone was there. A shadowy figure stood a few feet away, partially hidden by the trees. She couldn't see their face, but she could feel them watching. Watching the cabin. Watching her. Watching everything. Her pulse raced. Who else knew Daniel Harper was here? A rush of panic surged through her. Had someone followed her? Had someone followed her children? She wanted to call out, to demand answers. But before she could make a sound, the figure turned and slipped away into the darkness. Margaret stood frozen, her mind reeling. What had her children gotten themselves into? And more importantly, who else was watching? The cold night air pressed against Margaret's skin, but she barely felt it. Her heart pounded as she stood frozen behind the trees, eyes locked on the empty space where the mysterious figure had stood just moments before. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to grab her children and pull them away from whatever this was. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. A million questions swirled in her head. Who was that shadowed figure? Were they watching Daniel? Or had they been following her? The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. If someone else knew Daniel Harper was here, then this wasn't just about her children sneaking out to help a man in need. This was something much bigger. Something dangerous. She turned back to the cabin, her breath catching in the crisp night air. Inside, Theo and Lillian were still speaking in hushed voices. Daniel sat slumped against the wooden wall, his hands clasped together tightly. His eyes darted to the window every few seconds as if expecting someone who wasn't them. Margaret's grip tightened against the tree trunk. She needed to know the truth. Steeling herself, she stepped forward, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. She approached the cabin's side wall, careful to avoid the front door where she might be seen too soon. She reached the corner of the structure and inhaled deeply before moving toward the back door. It hung slightly ajar, a single board nailed across the lower half in a half-hearted attempt at security. She hesitated, then pushed it open slowly. The door groaned. Margaret barely had time to register what was happening before something cold pressed against the side of her head. A knife. A sharp breath hitched in her throat. The hand gripping her arm tightened. "Who are you?" a hoarse voice demanded. Margaret's pulse spiked. She turned her head just enough to see the man behind her, tall, wrapped in a thick, ragged coat, his face partially obscured by a scarf. His eyes were sharp, wild, darting between her and the doorway. Daniel. Margaret's mind reeled. This is the same man my children have been sneaking off to help. The same Daniel Harper who had vanished 6 months ago without a trace. She fought to keep her voice steady. "I should be asking you the same thing," she said, barely above a whisper. Daniel's grip loosened slightly, but the knife remained. His eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, toward where Theo and Lillian were now rummaging through their backpacks. His face twisted with something unreadable: fear, desperation, guilt. Maybe all three. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he released her. Margaret stepped back, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had pressed. "You have 3 seconds to explain," she hissed. "Because if you think I'm about to let my children get involved in whatever this is." "They already are," Daniel interrupted. Margaret clenched her jaw. "What does that mean?" Daniel ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He glanced toward the front room, lowering his voice. "I didn't ask them to come. They found me on their own." Margaret's stomach twisted. Theo. Lillian. Her children had found him? Out here? Alone? She felt a sudden wave of nausea. "Why are you hiding?" she demanded. "People have been looking for you. Your family." "My family thinks I'm dead," Daniel cut in, his voice like gravel. "And they need to keep thinking that. If they know I'm alive, they'll be in danger." Margaret's fingers curled into fists. None of this was making sense. Danger from who? Daniel hesitated. A crack in his guarded expression. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "It's not safe for you to know." Margaret's patience snapped. "Not safe? Not safe?" She gestured toward the front room. "My children have been sneaking out in the middle of the night to help you, and you're telling me it's not safe for me to know why?" Daniel's gaze darkened. "If you knew, you wouldn't be able to forget it. And once they realize you know the truth, they'll come for you too." Margaret stiffened. "They." A cold weight settled in her chest. Whoever Daniel was hiding from, it wasn't just some old debt or a personal grudge. This was something much bigger. A sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps. Margaret turned sharply toward the door, but Daniel was already moving. In an instant, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her deeper into the cabin, toward a small storage room in the back. He pushed the door shut, leaving only a sliver of space for them to see. Through the crack, Margaret watched as Theo and Lillian tensed. The soft glow of their flashlight flickered against the wooden walls. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hurried. It was slow. Deliberate. 3 knocks. Silence. Another knock. Theo and Lillian exchanged a look. "It's not him," Theo whispered. Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. Not him. That meant they were expecting someone else. But this wasn't that person. Daniel pressed a hand against her arm, shaking his head as if to warn her not to move. The front door creaked open. Margaret held her breath. A voice. Low. Calm. Too calm. "I know you're in there." She recognized that voice. Her blood ran cold. Sheriff Wyatt. The sheriff stepped inside, his boots leaving wet imprints in the doorway. He scanned the room slowly, his fingers tapping against the side of his belt where his holster sat. His expression gave nothing away. Margaret could barely process what she was seeing. The sheriff? What was he doing here? Theo and Lillian didn't speak. They stood frozen, their small figures outlined by the dim flashlight beam. Margaret's heart ached. They looked so small, so vulnerable. And yet, they didn't look surprised. The sheriff exhaled through his nose. "Kids," he said, almost casually. "You know how dangerous it is to be out here this late?" Neither of them answered. Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her. Sheriff Wyatt took another step inside, looking around slowly. His eyes landed on the scattered blankets, the empty food wrappers near the fireplace. "You've been helping him, haven't you?" Still, no answer. He clicked his tongue. "You don't have to protect him. I know he's here." He turned his head slightly, voice lowering. "And I know who else is listening." Margaret's breath hitched. "He knows I'm here." Daniel shifted slightly, hand inching toward the handle of a drawer nearby. "A weapon?" Margaret had no idea. The sheriff sighed. "You kids need to go home." His voice was firm, but it wasn't a threat. "This is grown-up business. You don't want to get caught in the middle." Theo swallowed hard. "And if we don't?" Sheriff Wyatt finally looked at them directly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Then I'll have no choice but to bring your mother into it." Margaret's entire body went rigid. Lillian let out a shaky breath. You already have, haven't you?" The sheriff's expression didn't change. The silence stretched. Then, with one final look toward the shadows of the cabin, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. "Give this to him," he said simply. "Tell him he has 48 hours. Then he turned and walked out the door. The cabin fell into silence. Margaret barely registered Daniel moving beside her, barely registered Theo's shaking hands as he picked up the paper. All she could hear was the faint echo of the sheriff's parting words. 48 hours. To do what? Margaret's world was unraveling fast. And she wasn't sure she'd survive it. The cabin was silent except for the distant howling of the wind through the trees. Margaret's mind reeled, her thoughts colliding like crashing waves. 48 hours. The sheriff had given Daniel 48 hours, but for what? To leave? To turn himself in? Or was it something worse? Daniel stepped forward, his hands visibly shaking as he picked up the folded paper Sheriff Wyatt had left on the wooden table. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it as if it might explode in his hands. Margaret wanted to demand answers, wanted to tear the paper from his grip and read whatever message had just shattered the already fragile reality of this night. But something in Daniel's expression stopped her. Theo and Lillian hovered nearby, their faces pale in the dim light of the lantern. Lillian's fingers clutched at the hem of her coat, and Theo's hands were balled into fists. They knew something. More than they had let on. Margaret finally found her voice, but it came out hoarse. "What's in that letter?" Daniel inhaled sharply, then, as if making some internal decision, unfolded the paper with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes scanned the page, and his expression darkened. His jaw clenched so tightly that Margaret thought his teeth might crack. She couldn't take it anymore. "Daniel." Her voice was sharper now, more urgent. "What does it say?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he exhaled a breath that sounded like defeat. "It's a warning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or a threat. Depends on how you look at it." Margaret felt a chill deeper than the winter air. "What kind of warning?" Daniel turned the paper so she could see it. The handwriting was rough, almost hurried. Just one sentence, scrawled across the page in thick black ink. 48 hours. Or your family finds out the truth. Margaret's blood ran cold. She didn't even know what the truth was, but the weight of those words settled over her like a suffocating fog. Lillian's voice trembled. "Who sent it?" Daniel's hands tightened around the letter. Wyatt didn't write this. He's just the messenger. Margaret's stomach twisted. The sheriff was involved in whatever this was, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. There was someone else, someone more powerful, more dangerous. Her patience snapped. Daniel, what is going on? Why are you hiding? Who are you running from? For the first time since she had walked into this cabin, Daniel looked directly at her. His eyes were hollow, haunted. I used to think I knew the people in this town, he murmured. I thought I understood who to trust. I was wrong. Margaret clenched her jaw. That's not an answer. Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. No, I suppose it's not. He sank onto a crate near the fireplace, rubbing a hand over his face. I found something. Something I wasn't supposed to. And when I refused to stay quiet, they made sure I disappeared. Margaret's heart pounded. Who are they? Daniel hesitated, as if debating whether or not to tell her. Then, in a low voice, he said, the town council. Margaret blinked. The town council? It was absurd. The council was made up of old men who argued over road repairs and Christmas parade routes. They weren't criminals. Daniel must have seen the disbelief in her expression because he leaned forward, his voice urgent. You think they're harmless. That's what everyone thinks. That's how they've gotten away with it for so long. Margaret crossed her arms. Gotten away with what? Daniel hesitated again, then he reached into the pocket of his ragged coat and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He handed it to her without a word. Margaret unfolded it and read the headline. Property dispute leaves local man without home. She skimmed the article. It was from 7 months ago. It detailed how an elderly man, Howard Grayson, had been forced out of his home after the town council had claimed the land for a new development project. The man had tried to fight it, but legal loopholes had allowed the council to seize the property. Margaret remembered this. The whole town had whispered about it, but no one had done anything. The house had been bulldozed within weeks, and the land had sat untouched ever since. Margaret frowned. I don't understand. This was legal, wasn't it? Daniel's jaw tightened. On the surface, yes. But the deal was rigged. Howard's house wasn't the only one they took. There were 6 others. All bought up by phantom companies, businesses that don't actually exist. Margaret's breath hitched. You're saying the council stole these homes? I'm saying they stole them, laundered the land through fake sales, and pocketed the money. And when I found proof, he let out a heavy breath. They made sure I vanished. Margaret stared at him, her pulse racing. Why you? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. I was their accountant. The words hit her like a slap. Margaret had known Daniel for years. He had always been good with numbers, always the one people trusted to handle their finances. She had never thought much of it. But now, she saw it in a different light. They made a mistake, Daniel continued. They didn't expect me to dig into their records. They thought I'd just sign off on the paperwork. But when I realized what was happening, I confronted them. Margaret gripped the newspaper tighter. And they, what? Threatened you? Daniel's expression darkened. Threatened my family. Margaret swallowed hard. So you ran. I didn't have a choice. His voice was raw. If I stayed, they would have made sure I disappeared for real. A heavy silence fell between them. Margaret's mind raced. This was bigger than she had imagined. Corruption, fraud, threats, it was like something out of a crime novel. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. And now, her children were caught in the middle of it. She turned to Theo and Lillian, her chest tightening. How long have you known? Theo looked down. A couple of weeks. Lillian wiped her nose with the sleeve of her coat. We found him by accident. We were playing near the woods and saw him sneaking into the cabin. Margaret inhaled sharply. And you didn't tell me? Theo's eyes were glassy. We were scared. We didn't know what to do. He was starving, Mom. He looked so bad. We couldn't just leave him. Margaret felt something crack inside her. Her children, her sweet, caring children, had been protecting a man on the run. They had risked everything because they had bigger hearts than most adults in this town. And yet, now they were all in danger. She turned back to Daniel. 48 hours. What does it mean? Daniel exhaled slowly. It means they're done waiting. They're either going to force me out of hiding, or bury me for good. Margaret felt her pulse roar in her ears. A decision had to be made. Because if they waited too long, it might already be too late. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around Margaret as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. 48 hours. Less than 2 days before the faceless figures pulling the strings behind the town's corruption made their move. She had spent her whole life believing that their sleepy town was different, untouched by the greed and cruelty of the outside world. But she had been wrong. Her children had known before she did. That alone made her stomach twist in guilt. They had seen something she hadn't, the desperation of a man who had nowhere to turn, the cracks in the foundation of their so-called peaceful town. And instead of running, instead of ignoring it, they had done the only thing they could. They had helped. Now, they were tangled in something that had been meant to stay buried. Margaret ran a hand over her face, forcing herself to focus. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice low but firm. Daniel's expression remained unreadable, but she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of carrying this burden alone for too long. And go where? He asked. They have eyes everywhere. Margaret exhaled sharply, pacing the small room. The sheriff had been careful, leaving that letter instead of making a direct threat. That meant there were still rules, still limits to what they could do, at least for now. But those limits wouldn't last forever. She turned to Theo and Lillian. Does anyone else know? Have you told anyone about Daniel? Theo hesitated before shaking his head. No. We didn't know who to trust. Margaret felt a pang of relief. That meant, at least for now, they still had the element of surprise. The people controlling the town didn't know she was involved yet, not fully. But that wouldn't last. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this, he muttered. Especially not you. Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. Too late for that. She felt Daniel watching her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, he turned his gaze toward the door, his fingers tapping against his knee in a nervous rhythm. If I leave, they'll find me. If I stay, I put you all in danger. He let out a humorless chuckle. No good options. Margaret's mind raced, running through every possibility. Running wasn't an option, not when they were dealing with people powerful enough to make a man disappear without a trace. But staying here, waiting for them to make their move? That wasn't an option either. There had to be another way. She turned back to Daniel. You said you found proof, right? Daniel nodded slowly. Before they forced me out, I made copies of their financial records. The real ones, the ones that show where the money went, how they laundered it, everything. Margaret's breath hitched. Where are they? Daniel hesitated, then his gaze flickered toward the floorboards. Margaret followed his line of sight. You hid them here? Daniel nodded. Under the floorboards, near the fireplace. Margaret didn't waste a second. She knelt down, running her fingers along the edges of the old wooden planks. After a moment, she felt it, a loose board. She pried it up, revealing a small, wrapped bundle. Inside were several folders, filled with documents, financial statements, and handwritten notes. It was enough to destroy them. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what they're afraid of." Daniel nodded. "This is why they want me gone." Margaret closed the folder carefully, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. They needed to get this information out, but to who? The sheriff was compromised. So was the town council. And then it hit her. "The press," she said suddenly. Daniel frowned. "What?" Margaret stood, gripping the folder tightly. "We can't go to the police, we can't go to the mayor, but if we get this to a journalist, someone outside the town, someone they can't control, then they won't be able to cover it up." Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "It's risky." "It's the only shot we've got," Margaret countered. She turned to her children. "You two need to go home. Right now. Pretend you were never here." Lillian's eyes widened. "But..." "No arguments," Margaret cut in. "If anyone asks, you were asleep in your beds all night. Do you understand?" Theo clenched his jaw but nodded. Margaret turned back to Daniel. "We have 48 hours. We need to move fast." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then let's go." They moved quickly, bundling up against the cold before slipping out of the cabin into the dark woods. Every sound, every rustling branch felt like a potential threat, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, Margaret could already see the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Someone was watching. Someone new. And they were running out of time. The air was thick with tension as Margaret and Daniel crouched behind the tree-line, staring at the headlights flickering through the darkness. The realization hit Margaret like a freight train. Whoever was controlling this town's corruption already knew they were making a move. Her mind raced. How long had they been watching? Had the sheriff set a trap? Was there someone else lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to slip up? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "We can't go through the main roads." Margaret nodded, gripping the bundle of documents tightly to her chest. "There's a back road through the old sawmill. It leads out to the highway. We can get to the next town from there." Daniel hesitated. "They might have it watched." "They might have everything watched," she countered. "We don't have another choice." Daniel clenched his jaw but nodded. They moved quickly, sticking close to the tree-line, careful not to break into an outright sprint that might draw attention. Every shadow felt like it was shifting, every gust of wind like an unseen presence watching them. Margaret forced herself to breathe, forced herself to focus. They made it past the first row of houses unnoticed, cutting through the narrow alley behind the diner where the scent of grease and old coffee lingered in the air. The town was quiet, too quiet. It felt unnatural for Christmas Eve. There should have been laughter, the sounds of late-night festivities. But there was only silence. As they reached the outskirts, Margaret caught movement to the left, a figure stepping out onto the sidewalk near the post office. She grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him into the shadows just as a voice rang out. "Going somewhere?" Margaret's stomach dropped. Sheriff Wyatt stood under the yellow glow of the street lamp, his stance casual, but his hand resting dangerously close to his holster. Daniel stiffened beside her, his fists clenching at his sides. Margaret forced her face into something neutral. "Just taking a walk," she said smoothly. Wyatt chuckled. "A walk? This late? And here I thought you'd be at home, tucking your kids into bed." Margaret's nails dug into her palms. She refused to let her expression betray the panic seeping into her veins. "I couldn't sleep." Wyatt nodded, as if considering her words. Then his gaze flickered to Daniel. Funny thing, he said, voice deceptively calm. I was just thinking about you, Harper. Daniel didn't move, his expression unreadable. Is that so? Wyatt stepped closer, his boots crunching on the ice-covered pavement. You know, we gave you a fair warning. His eyes darkened, the friendly act slipping. 48 hours. That was generous. Margaret swallowed hard. Wyatt's gaze flickered to the bundle of papers pressed against her chest. But you don't look like someone who's planning to cooperate. Margaret's grip tightened. He knew. She had seconds, to decide what to do. Daniel beat her to it. With a single, swift motion, he grabbed the bundle from her arms and took off running. Wyatt cursed, reaching for his radio. He's on the move, he barked. Margaret barely had time to react before the sheriff turned back to her. You just made a mistake, Margaret. She met his gaze, forcing herself to stay calm. You already made one, she countered. Wyatt's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're playing a dangerous game. Margaret squared her shoulders. So are you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Wyatt exhaled sharply and took a step back. Go home, Margaret, he said, voice quieter now, almost like a plea. Pretend you never saw anything. It's your last chance. Margaret didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't run, running meant fear, but her heart pounded with every step she took back toward her house. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were shaking. Theo and Lillian were waiting inside, their faces pale. Mom. Margaret shook her head, forcing her voice to stay steady. He got away. Lillian swallowed hard. For now. Margaret sat down heavily on the couch. We need to be ready for what comes next. Because she knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not even close. The house was suffocatingly silent, the weight of everything that had happened pressing against Margaret's chest like an iron vice. She sat on the couch, staring at the floor, her mind racing with possibilities, outcomes, and worst-case scenarios. Theo and Lillian sat across from her, their faces still pale, eyes darting between her and the front door as if they expected someone to burst through it at any moment. And maybe they weren't wrong to be afraid. Daniel had gotten away, for now. But Sheriff Wyatt wasn't going to let this slide. And the people behind him? The real ones pulling the strings? They wouldn't be as patient. Margaret exhaled slowly. She needed a plan. We have to get ahead of this, she said finally, looking up at her children. Daniel's running, but he's not safe yet. And neither are we. Lillian swallowed hard. What do we do? Margaret stood up, forcing her hands to stop shaking as she paced the small living room. We still have the backup copies of the documents. That's our leverage. We need to get them into the right hands before they catch him. Theo frowned. But who can we trust? Wyatt's got the police, the mayor's in on it, and everyone else is either scared or looking the other way. Margaret nodded. That's why we go outside the town. We need to reach someone who isn't under their control. Her mind settled on one name, Angela Rowe, an investigative journalist from a nearby city who had built her career exposing small-town corruption. Margaret had read her articles, had seen the way she tore through carefully constructed lies and dragged the truth into the light. If anyone could bring this conspiracy down, it was her. But they had to get to her before Wyatt and his people realized what they were doing. Margaret turned to her children. Pack a bag. Only the essentials. We're leaving in 20 minutes. Theo's eyes widened. Wait, tonight? Lillian hesitated. Mom, are we really just going to leave? Margaret's throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. It's the only way to keep you safe. Neither of them argued. They disappeared down the hall, and Margaret moved to the kitchen, grabbing a duffel bag and stuffing it with cash from her emergency stash, a few water bottles, and a first aid kit. She didn't know how long they'd be gone, but she had a sinking feeling they wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. She paused by the dining table, staring at the framed photos lining the wall. Their life here, the safety, the normalcy, was gone. The people running this town had taken it from them the moment her children overheard something they shouldn't have. Margaret clenched her fists. No more running. She was halfway through zipping the duffel bag when the front porch creaked. Her breath caught. A shadow passed across the window. Then, 3 knocks. Her pulse roared in her ears. It was just like at the cabin. Slow. Deliberate. She reached for the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight, and stepped toward the door. "Mom?" Lillian whispered from the hallway. Margaret motioned for her to stay back. Another knock. She took a deep breath and cracked the door open. Daniel stood on the porch, his clothes soaked from melted snow, his face pale and drawn. Margaret exhaled sharply and pulled him inside. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "Wyatt's looking for you." Daniel collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. "I know," he rasped. "They found me. I barely made it out." Margaret's stomach twisted. "How?" Daniel wiped a hand over his face. "I ran toward the old quarry, thinking I could lose them in the trees. But they had people waiting. They weren't just looking to scare me this time, Margaret." Her blood ran cold. "They were trying to kill you." Daniel nodded slowly. Margaret inhaled deeply, trying to push down the panic clawing at her chest. "We need to move now." Daniel glanced at the packed bags by the couch. "You were already planning to leave." "We're taking the documents to Angela Rowe," she said. Daniel's eyes darkened. "That's not going to be enough." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel straightened, his expression grim. "I heard them talking while they were looking for me. They're not just covering up stolen money, Margaret. There's something bigger happening. Something they don't want anyone to know." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What?" Daniel hesitated. "They're not just stealing land. They're using it." She frowned. "For what?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "To dump toxic waste." Margaret's breath hitched. "That land they seized? It wasn't just about money. They've been bringing in shipments of industrial waste from companies outside the state, companies that didn't want to pay for proper disposal. And they've been burying it here, in our town." Margaret felt her knees go weak. "That's why they can't afford to be exposed." Daniel nodded. "If this gets out, it won't just be about corruption charges. We're talking federal crimes. Environmental violations. Lawsuits." Margaret gritted her teeth. "And they're willing to kill to keep it quiet." A heavy silence fell between them. Then, without another word, Margaret grabbed the car keys. They weren't just running anymore. They were going to end this. Daniel slid into the back seat, ducking low, while Theo and Lillian sat beside Margaret. She gripped the wheel tightly, her heart hammering. She pulled out onto the road, heading toward the highway. The town lights faded behind them as they moved deeper into the countryside. For a moment, there was only the sound of tires crunching over ice and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the car. Then, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Margaret's breath caught. Another pair joined them. Then a third. Theo's voice was barely a whisper. "They're following us." Margaret's grip on the wheel tightened. "Hold on." She slammed her foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the speedometer climbing as they tore down the empty road. But the headlights behind them didn't fade. They were gaining. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. There was no way they could outrun them. They needed another plan. Up ahead, the road curved toward an old service road that led through the hills. It was narrow, dangerous in the winter, and barely maintained. She took it anyway. The tires skidded as she turned sharply onto the icy path. Trees blurred past them, the road twisting and turning as she pushed the car to its limits. The vehicles behind them hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough time. Margaret spotted an old hunting trail cutting off the main road. Without thinking, she jerked the wheel and veered off, the car bouncing violently over uneven terrain. They hit a dip. The car jolted, nearly throwing them from their seats, but Margaret kept going. Then, silence. The headlights disappeared. Margaret pulled into a thicket of trees and cut the engine. For several minutes, they sat in breathless silence, listening. Nothing. Then, in the distance, the sound of tires screeching against pavement. The pursuers had overshot the turn. Theo let out a shaky breath. Did we lose them? Margaret nodded slowly. For now. She turned to Daniel. How far to the city? Maybe an hour, he said. Margaret restarted the engine. Then let's finish this. They pulled back onto the road, their path set. By morning, the truth would be out. And the people who had been running this town from the shadows? Their time was up.